let me walk us through then some of these things about the Old Testament. You'll notice there's a quote in your textbooks, and some of you, there's like most of you have the third edition of this book. Some of you have the fourth edition of this book. The reason is because those of you who have the third edition, which most of you have, um, those are the ones that we had left over from previous iterations of Institute. And when I went to order more of them, they had just put out a new edition. So they stopped publishing the third edition. So I couldn't order anymore. So some of you have fourth edition, some of you have third edition. It's the same material. The page numbers are a little different. It's the same material with a few different little tiny things. So no big differences. Everyone's gonna be on the same page. But let me preface our study of the Old Testament by saying this. Let me use two illustrations to do this. The studying the Old Testament, maybe Christine, a little bit to your point, is like this. Pretend with me for a minute, and I know this is hard for us, but as much as we can, pretend with me for a second that you are able, or you have only ever in your whole life been exposed to black and white silent movies. Okay? You've only ever seen black and white silent movies. You know nothing of color television, nothing of color movies. You know nothing of sound and actually like recorded sound. It's just voiceover or it's just the text. Actually, there's little sound, it's music, but the dialogue is all text, right? At the bottom. So silent black and white movies. That's the world you live in. You know nothing else. You don't even know that anything else exists. Okay. Just if we can get in that headspace for a second. And then all of a sudden, one day, you get just thrown into an IMAX movie theater with like surround Dolby Atmos sound and a screen that is huge and like a Marvel movie. Okay. The shock to your system that like juxtaposition of black and white silent film to like seeing a Marvel movie or like a Star Wars movie or something that's just kind of on this grand, crazy scale with all kinds of CGI, all kinds of this color, sound. It's loud. You're in an IMAX theater. That stark jump is what it can feel like for us to go from our world, where we kind of understand things and things make sense to us and we're like, great, to go back thousands and thousands and thousands of years to study something completely foreign. Um, in every possible way, it is foreign, with the exception of, oh, these are also human beings. Everything about their life looks different than us. Everything about how they thought the world is different than us. Their language is so far removed from us. The languages of the people around them are so far removed from us. Their way of conceiving of themselves, their way of conceiving of their deity or deities, their way of understanding their role and their place in the world, all of these things. It's like that stark contrast of black and white silent film to Marvel movie. Like just the gulf is huge. Okay, so when we come to Old Testament studies, there are so many bridges we have to try to cross, and so many gaps that we have to try to fill in, and so many questions that we might have that may or may not actually be the right questions to ask, because culturally speaking, the culture we're studying doesn't care about those questions, so they're not going to answer them for us. So those types of things, okay? Another illustration I'll give you that's a little bit more easy for us to grasp is if you've ever traveled to a country where you don't speak the language, and you are like the bumbling American on, traveling to India, or you're traveling, to China, or you're traveling to, Japan or something like that, or you're traveling somewhere in South America, and you are the minority and you do not know the language, and you're just trying to order something at McDonald's like a normal American, right? Like, which is the worst possible thing you could do is go to another country and eat at McDonald's. But it just screams America. But anyways, it's that kind of stark, just you get off the plane and you are not in control. You are not the norm. You are not you don't know the language, you don't know the culture, you don't know the rules, you don't know how they think about things, you don't know how their government is set up, maybe. Like that kind of contrast, again, just trying to get us more okay with the idea that we might not know as much about the Old Testament as we think we do. And there's a lot to learn. And a lot of it is just like crossing several bridges and trying to get in the headspace of ancient Near Eastern peoples, especially in the first part of the Old Testament, and the world in which they lived. Again, going back to our exegesis that we've been doing for so many weeks, context, context, context. We got to understand cultural context, linguistic context, theistic context. What are they thinking about this? How are their governments interacting with each other? All of those things are happening in and around the world of the Old Testament. I keep saying New Testament because I just got off another Zoom call where I was TAing for a New Testament class. So trying to keep my brain straight here. All of those things apply to the Old Testament. Um, and how we study it. So don't leave your exegesis at the door. Bring it right on into Old Testament and start looking at things kind of through those lenses. Okay, let me do this. I'm going to walk us through a few things here. The authors of your textbook say this, and I'm not going to share my slides because I still have a few people who are kind of coming in and out, and I need to be able to see that. But they say this: the Old Testament's objective is not transformed lives, though knowing God should transform one's life. The Old Testament's objective is not the adoption of a value system, though a value system would certainly be one outcome of knowing God in a real way. The Old Testament is not a repository of historical role models, dusty hymns, and obscure prophetic sayings, but it is this: it is God's invitation to hear his story. It is God's invitation to hear his story. It's not just a collection, again, of dusty names and places and things that we don't understand. The goal of the Old Testament is not even to transform your life in and of itself as a text. It is to tell you God's story. Now, does knowing God's story transform your life? 100%, right? But the Old Testament as a text exists because a people group once wanted to record and write down their experiences with their deity in the ancient Near East and time periods following. Okay. Um, Let me say this. Some of you kind of hinted at it in our discussion earlier. Some of you hinted at it a bit in your comments this week on Google Classroom. We need to be careful in the language we use about how the Old Testament and the New Testament are connected. A few of you use the word discontinuity, which is kind of a no-no. And again, you don't know what you don't know, and that's fine. No one's upset. But there is absolutely continuity between the Old Testament and the New Testament. And we're going to explore that as we do Old Testament and New Testament, and we'll explore that even more as we get into Christian theology later on. There is absolutely continuity. Typically, what most of us do, and I'm not going to unpack all this right now, I'm going to plant the seed and then we're going to start watering the seed over the next couple weeks. Typically, what most of us have kind of grown up hearing, or if it's not what we think, it's what people's perception of the Bible is sometimes, is that, oh, God in the Old Testament is all about like Israel and covenant and right and wrong, and you do this, I do this, you don't do this, I will, whatever, right? He's harsh, he's judgmental, he might even be okay with genocide if you read it a certain way. Like this is kind of the picture that some people have, right? And then all of a sudden you get to New Testament and like here's Jesus meek and mild, like just loving everyone and everyone's great and like all these things, right? That's not true. It's not true. Good scholarship can help us get beyond that. But there is absolutely continuity between what the Old Testament says and what the New Testament says and how they work and how they're connected. And we're going to explore, we're not going to answer all that tonight. We're going to explore that over the next 20 weeks or so, really, is what we'll be doing. So be careful to not use things like discontinuity. So you read, I think you read about a guy named Marcion, who decided that the Old Testament God was different than the New Testament God, ruled a heretic at the council. So we don't want to be doing that, right? We don't want to be in the pool of heresy. That's typically frowned upon. Although I've been called a heretic before, which let me just offer this as a side note. You realize that like you and I individually don't have the authority to just call people heretics, right? Like that's a council, that's a church-wide decision to declare heresy and to decide, which is why we don't do it very often, because it has to be a church-wide decision. Now, if you are interacting with someone who is participating in thoughts that have been declared heretical by councils, great. Okay, you can go there. But I've been called a heretic by multiple people, and I'm like, you don't have the authority to do that. Like, that's not how the system works. So we just have to be careful when we have those conversations, right? Jocelyn, I see your hand. I'll get to you in just a second. Thanks for doing that. Okay, let me keep going with a few of these ideas, and then we'll do some questions here in a second. So what do we do when we approach the Old Testament? What are some good steps? What are some good rules of thumb? The first, and these are not in any particular order, But let me offer these to us as again, as we think through exegesis. This is gonna dovetail. Hebrew literature is not our literature. Hebrew literature is not our literature. We must learn how the Old Testament wants to be read as the type of literature that it actually is. Okay? So Hebrew literature is not our literature. Your textbook talks about this. If you have the fourth edition, which I know not most of you do, it's on page 30. I don't have my old textbook with me. I didn't bring it on this trip, but it's in chapter 3 in that introduction to the Pentateuch. It's very early in that chapter. So regardless of which edition you have, it's in that introduction to the Pentateuch chapter. There's kind of, for me, it's like a page or two in, there's a heading that says the literature of the Pentateuch. Again, this is just talking about the first 5 books: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. That's the Pentateuch, right? We'll talk more about that later. But this applies to just Old Testament in general. You have things like prose narrative. You have things like poetry. You have things like prophetic revelation, Torah, which we talk about Torah being the first 5 books, but Torah is also a style of writing. It's a style of the way the literature is concocted and what it represents. So Hebrew literature is not our literature. Hebrew poetry is different than English poetry. They don't have like the sonnet form. They don't have a limerick form. They don't have there's not like a haiku, which is not an English style, but they don't. Hebrew poetry is Hebrew poetry. It's beautiful, it's complicated, it has all the things that you would expect in poetry, but it's not English poetry. There's some similarities, of course. We get things like similes, metaphors, but it's firmly Hebrew, if I can say it that way. Hebrew narrative is firmly Hebrew. The way they construct stories is different than the way you and I might be inclined to tell stories, which is why when we read the Old Testament sometimes, we're left going, why didn't they say anything about all of these questions I have? Why did they not give any detail about these things that I find to be the most important? It's because it's just not how they care about story and narrative. They're constructing it in an entirely different way. Like in every sense of the word, it's different. Yeah, they're telling a story, but they're doing it in their own form. So, one of the best things we can do, and I've mentioned this a few times, and this is what we're learning in Institute. We're not going to wake up tomorrow and have this click in our brains. One of the things we are learning in Institute, slowly but surely, through the power of the Holy Spirit giving us wisdom, is we must learn to ask the questions the text wants to be asked, which means don't lose the forest for the trees. Don't try to go off on a tangent on this one thing that the author doesn't give any further information on before you actually try to settle into what's actually the main point of the argument. Now, sometimes those tangents are great and they can lead to interesting things, but don't go there until we're actually able to cohesively explain, here's the main kind of gist of the argument. Here's the point of what they're doing. Here's how I would outline the story. Here's how I would summarize the psalm, those types of things, okay? So we have to encounter the Old Testament for the type of literature it actually is, not how we think it is as 21st century Western people, okay? It's not our literature. The Old Testament is not our literature. It's ancient Hebrew literature, okay? And we have to read it and treat it and approach it as such. The second thing is we, again, 21st century Western people, post scientific revolution, post enlightenment, we are very, very concerned with quote unquote historical accuracy. Okay. This happened, then this happened, and there were 12 people there, and I can verify that there were 12 people there with 7 other sources, and it happened at 11:37 a.m. Right then, it was a full moon, like all these things, right? We want as much detail as possible so that we can prove it, right? Again, quote unquote historical accuracy in our minds. Old Testament writers are not concerned with that in the same way we are. They just are not. It's not part of how they tell stories. It's not part of how they concoct narrative in the same way. It typically, again, those types of details, the quote unquote historical accuracy that we want, is not the main point of their narratives. It's not the main point of their stories. It's not the main point of their dialogues and the discourse, right? So, again, we have to learn, and this is going to happen slowly, how to approach the Old Testament for the type of literature it actually is. Not just because we have it in English in front of us doesn't mean it's an English document from the 21st century, right? It's thousands and thousands and thousands of years old, right? And once again, we need to first learn to slowly kind of ascertain, how do we ask the right questions of the text? Not what our current culture and philosophy tells us are the more important questions to ask. What does the text seem to be keep coming back to? what does the text seem to have at its middle, at its like high point? What does the text seem to be repeating? What does the text seem to be indicating about God? Um, those types of questions, not, oh, what can I get out of it initially? Again, we're going to get there. Application and synthesis are important, but we have to encounter the text on its own terms first. Okay. This is also true of the New Testament, but it might even be more especially true for us when we read the Old Testament because it's just so old. Like it's just so ancient, right? This is ancient literature. Like in every sense of the word is ancient literature, right? Okay, just a few more things, and then we'll stop for questions and comments. I showed you this, I think, the very first week of our group. Or I'm not, I know you can't see it, but let me just, I'll walk you through it, and I will post these slides, okay? So remember with me that the Old Testament is divided up into three main parts, right? The Pentateuch, the Torah, the first five books, the prophets, and the writings. Okay, so the Pentateuch or Torah, the prophets, and the writings, which in Hebrew it's the Torah, the Nevi'im, and the Ketuvim, right? So the Pentateuch or Torah, the prophets, and the writings. These three sections are how you will kind of navigate partially where you are, because each of those three sections, while of course they are connected to the others, they operate independently in some sense. The Torah stands alone, like very firmly, can stand on its own 2 feet by itself, as a self-contained collection of information, right? It is broadened and it is brought into even deeper focus when we connect it to the writings and the prophets. But the writings stand on their own, right? Things like Ecclesiastes and those types of things, they stand on their own. The prophets, as a collection of stories and narratives and books, stand on their own. And so in the Hebrew Bible, they are divided thusly, which is why if you get a Hebrew Bible that's in Hebrew, it is in a different order than our English Bible. The Torah starts it all: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Those are the same. But then the order of the rest of it gets a little out of whack because they group the writings and the prophets accordingly. They don't have them kind of jumping in and out of each other, which our English translations do. So that's just a good thing to realize, that those are the three main sections. And we'll talk more about those sections as we move on. But be aware, as you approach the Old Testament, those are the three main sections. Those are the three big ideas that kind of form and hold the Old Testament. You have Torah, you have like the teachings, the instructions, the law. That it means more than just law, but it kind of, get in that vein of instruction and writings and those types of things, or instruction and direction. Then you get like the prophetic books, which again stand on their own and serve a purpose, and you get the writings. And so these are all working together to kind of formulate Israel's identity, to formulate how Israel understands themselves as a nation and as a people that seems to be unique among the people that they are interacting with. So good to remember that Torah, prophets, and writings is how the Old Testament is situated within itself in the pure sense of the word. Like that's how the books form and fit together. They fall into one of those categories, okay? Okay, let me pause right there and see if anyone has questions. Again, just unmute yourself and ask away, and we'll try not to have mass chaos.
I don't know if I have a question as much as just an observation. We just got back from Ireland and going through the medieval mile, and when you see something really, really old like that, like we don't see in the States. I mean, that was my first. I guess we were in Greece, but for the first time, for some reason, it hit me that these are ancient writings, and just how amazing it is that they're still where we can read them. I mean, it's just fascinating to me.
Yes, absolutely. And a little bit of as an aside to that, remember with me that things like the Torah, like Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, those weren't like actually put together in the form we have them and written down until way after the events in those books. And so the continuation of that narrative and the remembering and the storytelling that had to happen and the cohesive nature of Israel in that is astounding. Because these are ancient documents that we have, but they're not even as ancient as the story that they're telling. So this is an ancient story in an ancient world, in an ancient worldview that we are encountering. Which is why it is okay when it feels so strange or so foreign to us. That's okay. It's expected. If you go to the Old Testament and you're like, everything makes sense to me, I question that a lot, right? It is confusing. It should be very confusing at parts and at points. I mean, we have been mistaught about it in different ways, and we're going to unpack some of that. But yeah, that's great, Deb. Thank you for sharing that. Anyone else, questions or thoughts up to this point?
I have a quick question. So this might be kind of a silly question, but so so the Bible that Jesus would have known and his people would have been all of that, correct?
So by Bible you mean scrolls.
I mean, yeah, I
Yeah,
mean
yeah,
like
yeah.
I'm sorry. I mean
No, no, you're fine. You're fine.
the scripture, whatever. Yeah, yeah.
I'm being silly with you. So yeah, they would have had certain things like the Pentateuch is pretty much it's solidified. Like we that's done and dealt with, especially by the time we get to Jesus. The some of the prophets, obviously Jesus unfurls the scroll of Isaiah and reads it in synagogue one time, right? Um, but not all of the books would have been quote unquote their Bible yet. And again, I'm using that word anachronistically, their Bible. Some of those books are just kind of used as wisdom literature and as teaching, but they're not nearly. So, for example, you ask someone back in Jesus' time, "Hey, does the book of like Ecclesiastes, for example, does it have as much authority as the Pentateuch?" The answer would be absolutely not. Absolutely not. Which for us even the answer probably should be absolutely not. Ecclesiastes is great, right? But it's wisdom literature. It's like sayings. It's talking about it doesn't weigh as much in their mind and importance as Torah does, right? Or maybe even as the prophets. But not all of the books that we have, the 66, or the just the part of the Old Testament, total our Bible, but the Old Testament books would have been viewed as quote unquote scripture. That idea doesn't exactly exist in Second Temple Judaism, which is when Jesus was around. But they understood again Torah and some of the prophetic books, hugely important. They would read those in synagogue every and especially Torah because Torah is what gets read at like the high holy days, right? It informs their calendar, it informs their worship, it informs their festivals, it informs their feasts, things like Yom Kippur, those types of things. So some of it was yes, but not all of it that we would consider our Old Testament is understood as again, quote unquote, scripture at the time of Jesus. That kind of happens a little bit later. For example, now you bring up something, Christine, that reminds me of something I wanted to say. Your authors of your textbook, Hill and Walton, great guys, excellent men, wonderful scholars. But if you notice, if you looked at the back, which again, you should kind of check out where these guys are and what they're doing. They have, PhDs and they're teaching various places. This textbook leans conservative, and I don't mean that politically. I mean that from a biblical scholarship standpoint. So they're going to be conservative, like in the ways that they date the books. They're going to be conservative um, in how they approach Old Testament theology. They're going to be more conservative in their approach. For example, and I can't remember when they date Daniel. I have a feeling they date Daniel pretty early. More than likely, and I fall into this camp, Daniel is the last book written. Daniel is the latest book that we have that makes it into the Old Testament. Daniel, in its final form, probably not composed until just a couple of hundred years before Jesus. During that intertestamental period, during Second Temple Judaism, and I have a feeling they date it early. I don't personally. Again, scholarship is going to be divided on this. So be aware as you read the book that they are going to lean a little bit more conservative on their kind of interpretation of the Old Testament and how they date things, how they situate it. Okay, any other questions before we kind of move on to our next little bit?
Yeah, just real quick, going back to earlier, you mentioned about discontinuity. So I realized in the textbook on page 71, the author mentioned, yet on the bottom of the page, he mentioned where the collective authors mentioned, yet we must recognize the contrast where discontinuity between the Old and New Testaments. I mean, are they misspoken? I mean, can you?
Yeah, I flat out disagree with them, which is fine. Like,
Okay.
you're not going to agree with everyone that you read, and you shouldn't. Like, and that's fine, right? I think this is an excellent Old Testament book. This is why we use it. It's an excellent Old Testament textbook. I disagree with them. In the language and in the use of the word discontinuity. I understand what they're getting at. And I'm like, yeah, it's the story seems to shift. There seems like but it is the collective still same continuous story of God. There's no discontinuity within the story, right? Moving from the Old Testament to the New Testament doesn't change the story. It's the same God. It's the same plan. It's the same covenant. It's the same everything, right? So I really don't like that they use the word discontinuity. Again, you might, and if you can formulate a defense for that and have a cohesive conversation with other people about it, great. Personally, I disagree with them on that, which again is fine. You are allowed and encouraged to read critically and to read these textbooks and go, okay, I hear what they're saying. I have some questions about that because it doesn't jive with maybe some other things that I've heard or thought or whatever. That's kind of like develop those kind of critical thinking muscles. But yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. Thank you for pointing that out. I just disagree with them. Okay, I see some of you pop in some questions here. Okay, Ross. Lorian, how does knowing Jewish traditions and Old Testament meanings deepen our understanding of the New Testament? Hugely, hugely. Let me give just a very brief kind of blip into that because we're going to cover it extensively in a few weeks. But let me just give an example. You ask again, should the church be more intentional in Jewish traditions? Yes, 100%. If we better understood the sacrificial system, and if we better understood the words pure and impure, our lives would be radically changed as Christians reading the New Testament in light of what Judaism during the Second Temple period and even in the Old Testament understood it, how they understood it. The sacrificial system, the ideas of being impure, pure, impure, those types of things, holiness. If we understood them through a quote unquote Jewish lens, our lives would be radically changed and we would be far better readers of the New Testament than we are. Good news on that front, my dear, dear friend Paul Sloan, who just wrote an excellent book about the law in the New Testament, and who is a professor of New Testament, and who specializes in kind of this very thing, is going to teach on October 21st for us. He's going to be in person with us. He's going to come and talk about Leviticus and how that then gets pulled forward in the New Testament. So yes, Ross, great question, 100%. And it's gonna become clear as we move through. So great. Okay, let me kind of move us to some further discussion here about the Old Testament. You remember a few weeks ago on the whiteboard, I drew out and we walked through the covenants. We walked through how they are a cohesive way of understanding the continuous story of God in the scriptures. Okay, it's the same God interacting with his people. He doesn't change his mind. He doesn't jump from one covenant to another for, to signal something completely different is happening. It's all continuous, right? And I said that this is one of the many ways that we can easily kind of communicate relatively quickly the big picture, capital S story of the Bible. Well, there's several others. One of them is kind of hinted at in your book as you read, that takes the majority of this kind of way of looking at it is in the Old Testament. So I want to kind of jumpstart us there again as we're getting ready to look at the Old Testament as a whole. And that is what your authors call and what I can call, just for ease right now, the stages or the places of God's presence. Okay? Stages or places or even locations of God's presence. Again, I will share these slides, so if you don't get it all, you're totally fine. The first of these is Eden. Okay, the Garden of Eden. We see God present in the Garden of Eden, right? So we're gonna situate the story of God, the scriptures, based on where we see God quote unquote dwelling. Okay, God's dwelling places. So Eden seems to be, if you read Genesis, and we'll talk more about Genesis specifically here in just a second. The way Genesis 1, 2, and the beginning of 3 situate themselves and communicate themselves and depict the story of the creation of the world to us, it is packed full of temple imagery and temple language. Eden is temple-like, okay? It has parallels with other ancient Near Eastern temple language and temple construction. For example, and we're kind of, again, I'm going to bounce back and forth between Genesis and what we're doing to kind of get our feet wet in both of these pools here. For example, the thing you would do when you built a temple in the ancient Near East, which all of the major religions had their temples, they all had their cultic sites, they all had their high holy places, okay? Israel's not unique in that. What you would do is you'd build a temple and you would fill it with all kinds of beautiful things, and you'd make it great and grand, and you would have, oftentimes you'd have like paintings or carvings of really fierce and ferocious beasts like guarding the way to God's presence. All these things, right? You can see some of these in museums today, usually in the British Museum that were taken from other places, which is a huge issue right now, but whatever. We can talk about that later. So you would see this, and what they would do is they would build the temple. It'd be great. They'd do all the things. And the very last thing typically that they would do in the ancient Near East is you would install the image of the deity, the idol of the deity in the temple. Okay, that's the last thing. That says the temple is done. Hooray, the deity is now here in the temple, right? So what does God do in Genesis 1 and 2, which again, we'll talk about the differences between those just in a second. We see creation, right? We see the world created. We see Eden created. And then if you read the first account, the last thing that happens really is God installs his image bearers into Eden, into the temple, right? And again, it's packed full of other kinds of temple imagery and language as well. The Bible Project does really good work on this idea. So feel free to go watch their videos, go listen to their podcasts, go do that. Anything about creation or Genesis, all that. Temple, tabernacle language, they're really good with that. So Eden is this first of several locations where God dwells among humans. Okay, and this is a theme in the Old Testament. I will dwell among you, you will be my people, I will be your God. We see this over and over and over again, especially in the Torah and especially even in the prophets. Countless times we get this language, okay? So we get stages of God's presence, we get Eden, and then we get, your textbook kind of says covenant, or some people will say covenant. God doesn't actually literally dwell in the covenant. Like his spirit, his presence isn't in the covenant, right? He establishes the covenant, he upholds the covenant, but it doesn't contain his presence, for lack of a better way of saying that. The next place we really get God's presence, like settled and dwelling, is the tabernacle, right? So we go Eden and we go tabernacle. Now, is God absent in the story? Absolutely not. He's continually interacting with like Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, right? Moses. All of those people have very personal interactions with God. So he's not abandoned the story. He's not left the story, still very present, but he's not dwelling among humans, which is again a goal that he says over and over and over and over again in the text. Go read Exodus. Like it's everywhere in there, right? So we go Eden, then we go tabernacle, and then we go first temple, temple number 1, Solomon's temple. Okay, remember? Again, we'll unpack this more as we go through the Old Testament, but I'm giving us a big picture overview. Remember with me, you got the tabernacle, the Ark of the Covenant's in the tabernacle. It's a traveling, it's a tent that they can roll up and travel because they're still a nomadic people. They're not in the promised land yet. They finally get into the promised land. You got Joshua and Judges. Then you get the kings. Saul's not a great king. You get David, who's a great king, according to the text. Not according to how he lives in a lot of ways, but according to the text, he's a great king. And David has a palace, and he's sitting up in the palace, and he goes, wait a second. He's like, I have this great palace. God lives in a tent. Something's not right here. Let me build God a temple, right? Because again, that's what you did back in the day, is you built your deity or deities a temple. This is not unique for Israel. All of the major religions have this, okay? And God tells him, no, your son can build it. So the first temple is sometimes called Solomon's temple because Solomon built it. You can read about that and the dedication of that, and we will moving forward in Old Testament. So you get that first temple, okay? Tabernacle, first temple. First temple is destroyed in about 586 or 587, depending on who you talk to, 587 BCE. During the Babylonian conquest and exile, which again, we will talk more about all the details and timelines of this. I'm giving us big picture overviews of things. These are things to kind of anchor down into that help us understand where we are in the story. Are we in tabernacle time? Are we in first temple time? Are we in second? It's very helpful to kind of get a picture of where you are in the story again, okay? So then we go first temple, Solomon's temple. That's destroyed in about 587 BCE, okay? We get the next place that you get God dwelling, and put a little asterisk next to this, or a little note to self, is the second temple. Again, Ezra and Nehemiah, they come back from exile. They start rebuilding the temple. Herod, during intertestamental period, helps finish that out. It is a wonder of the ancient world. It is magnificent, okay? However, some scholars will argue, and I'm among them, that God's spirit does not come back to dwell in that temple. Because you read the dedication of the first temple, Solomon's temple, the Spirit of the Lord fills it. The priests can't even perform their duties. God's presence is so thick in that temple when it is dedicated, right? This never happens with the second temple. The Spirit of the Lord never returns to it, okay? Because, and again, we'll talk more about this, preview of coming attractions, Israel, even though the second temple is built, and even though many of them are returning to the promised land, or to Canaan, or to Jerusalem and Judea, even though they're returning, they're still in exile. They're not in charge. Several other nations are ruling over them. And eventually we get to the New Testament, which is the second temple is what is standing when that's the temple that Jesus interacts with. God is not returned to the temple. He does with Jesus when Jesus enters the temple, but it is never filled with the Spirit of God. The Ark of the Covenant is not there. We do not know where the Ark of the Covenant went. Every time I talk about this, every time I do this lecture, someone asks, well, where's the Ark of the Covenant? And I have the same response every time, and some of you have heard it. If I knew, I would not be here. I would be on my multi-million-dollar book tour, okay? We don't know. It's a mystery. It disappears at some point between kind of first temple, second, we don't know, okay? Maybe it's in a box somewhere in archives in, the United States, deep underground, maybe in Colorado, with a swastika like burned on the side of it like we have in Indiana Jones. I don't know. But it burns it right off if you've seen the movie. So we all understand the power there. But anyways, we have very Indiana Jones ideas about the Ark of the Covenant. Most of them centralized in World War II for some reason. Like, thanks to Indiana Jones. But we don't know. But the second temple is never filled with the Spirit of the living God. Okay. So a little bit overlapping with the second temple, and because the second temple has that asterisk next to it, some argue you go tabernacle, first temple, Jesus. Right? So Jesus is God incarnate. He is the Logos. He is the Word made flesh. He is all of those things. He is fully God, and he dwells among us, right? So Jesus is now the place that God's presence dwells on earth, okay? So again, we have an asterisk next to the second temple. It is still important to keep the second temple in this list because it kind of stands as a reminder for how Israel as a nation functioned and how their religion functioned as well, right? Okay. So Jesus, the incarnation, is kind of the next stage, right? And then you get this little thing called Pentecost. And I realize we're in the New Testament now, but I want to help us land the plane with this illustration. You get Pentecost. So now it is God's people that are the place where God dwells on earth. The Spirit dwells within us. Paul tells us that it's the same Spirit that raised Jesus from the dead, lives in us now. We are empowered to be, we're told that you are a temple to the living God. A couple places in the New Testament tell us that, right? We get language in 1 Peter that tells us you are also a royal priesthood, doing temple business, right? So yeah, we get humans, Christians, people who are loyal to King Jesus are now the quote unquote temple. We are now God's dwelling place on earth. And then the final is the new creation. Okay. This is not a return to Eden. This is a moving on and moving up from Eden, okay? Eden is blown out of the water by the new creation. If you read the story and if you kind of assume some theological positions about it, which we'll talk about later. But that's kind of the stages of God's presence. And again, note, this has always been the plan. Like God dwelling with his people has always been the plan. This is not a cleanup mission. This is not a whoops. This is not, again, back to this idea, this is a continuous, not a discontinuous story, which is, again, why I quibble with some of the language about discontinuity. It's the same story. It's the same God doing the same thing, dwelling with his people over and over and over and over and over again, okay? Okay, let me pause right there and kind of help us just take a minute to start turning your brain more specifically toward Genesis. Here's what we're going to do. We are not going to talk about Exodus tonight. I had you read that chapter so you'd be a little bit ahead. I know it was a lot of reading this week, but I had a plan. Because this coming week, you're going to have to read 2 other chapters. So we will talk about Exodus next week. Tonight, for the rest of the time, we'll spend a little bit more on big picture Old Testament and Genesis specifically, okay? So we're going to turn our brains to Genesis a little bit here in just a second. But before we do that, let me point out just a few things in your textbook. Again, I realize page numbers are going to be a little different. I'll try to help us all find it. So on my book, which is the 4th edition, let me see here. Look at page 38 if you're in the 4th edition, which is in that chapter, Introduction to the Pentateuch. It's toward the end of that chapter. It's like 2 or 3 pages before the end of that chapter, and it's under the heading Historical Reliability. So if you go to the end of the chapter, Introduction to the Pentateuch, flip back a few pages. Hopefully there's something there if you're in the third edition that says something along historical reliability, interpretation of the Pentateuch, that type of heading, okay? The authors of this book point out that there are three main, or kind of the majority, three main approaches to the Old Testament. Some of you, okay, thank you so much, Heather. Page 67 if you're in the third edition. Thank you. If you can drop those in the chat, whoever finds it first, that'd be great. So let's look at these three real quickly, because these are the three kind of basic approaches to the historical reliability of the Old Testament, which is a little bit tricky to nail down sometimes, because we don't have a lot of supporting evidence. Sometimes we do, sometimes we don't. So look at what this says. I'm going to read again my edition. It says, today, this is a few paragraphs down. It says, today, there are three basic approaches to the historical reliability of the Pentateuchal and other Old Testament narratives. One, which is usually called the traditional approach, assumes the supernatural origin of the Old Testament and the complete historical accuracy of the biblical record. So these are going to be, generally speaking, your literal 7-day creationists. People in that kind of camp are gonna read the text this way, and they're gonna read all of it literally and take it kind of at face value, and what it says is what it is, and they believe it, right? It says this approach appeals to extra biblical and archaeological resources only to support and elucidate the reliable history of Israel already provided in the Bible. So these people have a really hard time. They do really well with archaeology that agrees with them. They have a really hard time with archaeology that might throw off their timeline, okay? Which exists, which is why we have different camps, because archaeology kind of can be taken in lots of different ways, and can help science even can be taken in lots of different ways. Hence why we have literal 7-day creationists and people who are theistic evolutionists. They can both be Christian. Okay, so that's the first way. It's kind of a literal, traditional approach. The second, they say, is the historical archaeological position. That's what they call it. It says this position presumes that the Pentateuch and the Old Testament as a whole is generally reliable. This means that the Old Testament in large measure preserved historical traditions rather than creating them. Archaeological data are employed as objective controls to the account of biblical history in lieu of the subjective literary and philosophical hypotheses. So these are going to be maybe a little bit more academic leaning positions that you might find more with some certain scholars who are quite concerned with actually making the story make sense within other parts of history that we have. Again, they're looking at it more concerned with archaeological data, and not even archaeological, but the ability to have other data that backs up the Bible from other cultures or other documents we have from the time, okay? That's the second position. The third position, it says, the third school of thought emphasizes the historical reconstruction of the biblical materials. This approach tends to reinterpret or recreate Hebrew history in light of extra-biblical literary and archaeological data and contemporary socio-political models. This should sound, all of these you should be able to maybe think about, okay, I can see maybe their exegetical position. Think of it that way. You can see kind of what they're wanting to do exegetically with the text. Either read it quite literally and woodenly, either letting other cultures or other things inform how they're reading it. This one is kind of looking at what's the context, what's the socio-political models around them, what's the archaeological data, what's the other literary evidence pointing toward, okay? This view takes a skeptical stance toward the biblical narratives because they are the work of pre-scientific ancient historians and subject to the quirks of historical memory. Generally, other ancient extra-biblical sources are considered more reliable than the Old Testament narratives, since they are older documents and hence closer to the events they report. The historical critical scholar, which hopefully we kind of are, again, that historical critical method that we learned about in exegesis, you remember that? The historical critical scholar uses a variety of methodologies, including source, literary, form, and tradition history criticism. Again, all of these things we talked about in exegesis, remember, to reconstruct the history of Israel, and holding that the biblical accounts themselves cannot necessarily be taken at face value. Now, let me pause right there. You can absolutely do historical critical reading of the text and believe that the Bible can be taken at face value. It's possible, okay? Again, I quibble with how they've kind of laid out these three things, but what I hope we're seeing is that you're going to have to decide at some point when you encounter the Old Testament what kind of reader of the Old Testament you are going to be. Are you a literal, it says it so it happened just like that? Are you a more, hey, I'm going to think about how people at this time thought about the world and thought of and how they conceived of it? Are you going to try to dig down into other source material we may have, even if it's outside of the Bible, to kind of compare and contrast it with the biblical text? All of those are doors that are open before you. Okay. And again, that Elements of Exegesis book is going to come in real handy when you start kind of digging through some of these questions. But just be aware that there are several ways to read the Old Testament, especially Genesis 1 through 11. Especially Genesis 1 through 11, because it's so weird. It's so weird. The text is strange. It's telling strange stories. We have other cultures that have flood stories, that have creation stories, that have Tower of Babel stories. So what are we doing with those? How are we interacting with them? Okay. We'll talk more about that in just a second. Okay. The other thing I want to point out in the textbook to us, for me, again, in fourth edition, it's on page 58. It's in the Genesis chapter. It is almost at the very end. It's under the major themes heading. Again, it's like maybe 2 or 3 pages from the end of that chapter, the Genesis chapter. It's the one that says focus on one God. It's under the major themes heading. I'll give us a kind of chance to find it. If one of you finds it, can you drop it in? It looks like Heather has it for us. Maybe. Oh, we got it. Oh, 90. Page 90 if you're in the other book. Thank you. I want to talk about monotheism for a second. Because I think, especially when we read the Old Testament, a lot of us are coming at monotheism with the idea that to be a monotheist means that you are asserting that there is only one God, period. No other gods exist. Hold on. My dog's in the room. I'm going to let him out so he can go see my parents because that's what he wants. So hold on. Otherwise, we're going to hear a lot of whining. Go on. Just the joys of practical life here. A lot of us are convinced that she says monotheism's on page 9. The section is on 92. That monotheism means there's only one God. Period. End of story. Nothing else exists. There's no other gods. When that's not entirely true, there are actually some nuanced approaches to monotheism. I personally don't ascribe to monotheism in that regard, and I'll explain that based on our textbook here. Okay, so take a look at this with me. Again, I'm reading from the fourth edition. It says, generally speaking, monotheism is the worship of one God. That's a distinction. Not one God exists. It is the worship of only one God. Okay. There are, however, several levels of monotheism, ranging from preference for one deity to worship of one deity to believing that only one deity exists. Even the Ten Commandments insist only on practical monotheism, which is exclusive worship of one deity, rather than on a philosophical monotheism, only one God exists. And you can keep reading and go back to that. But I wanted to kind of draw our attention to this idea that the world of ancient Israel is not one of monotheism insofar as monotheism might mean only one God exists. Okay? Which is why I'm all for only worship one God. That's why I'm a Christian. I think the God of the Bible is the only God you should worship. Do I think the God of the Bible is the only God that exists? No. And here's why. Well, the text tells us that that's not the case. Also, think with me of just the Ten Commandments. If no other gods exist, why do the Ten Commandments tell us to not worship other gods? Why is the text so concerned, especially the Old Testament, with telling the people, do not worship the foreign gods? It doesn't say they don't exist. It says don't worship them, right? It doesn't say, oh, they're dumb and they're just a stone there and or a rock there or a gold thing. That no, it describes them some level of authority and power. Paul tells us in the New Testament there are spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places, right? All of these things. So this is kind of the world of ancient Israel, okay? Other groups around them, other religions around them are polytheists. They have a pantheon of gods. Some are also more monotheistic leaning in that they might only worship their one God, but ascribe that these other gods exist, right? The Bible does not point to, oh, no other God, little g gods exist ever. No, they exist and you should not worship them. is what the text seems to indicate over and over and over and over again. Even the Ten Commandments. Just take the Ten Commandments. Have no other gods before me. If none of the other gods exist, why is this an issue? Right? So a practical monotheism only worship the one true God revealed in the scriptures. One of the consequences of exile that God tells them, and if they breach covenant, the consequence of breaking covenant is exile. But exile is not only, if you read the text carefully, it's not only, oh, you have to leave your home and you'll be drug off and be imprisoned elsewhere in a foreign, place. Exile is not only expulsion from your home. Exile is also, you are now subject to foreign nations and their gods. This is one of the consequences of exile. In the Old Testament, it is spelled out multiple times in multiple places. You are now subject to foreign rulers, foreign nations, and their gods, which is a huge problem if you're an Israelite, because you're only supposed to be subject to the one true God. The other gods exist. You're not supposed to have anything to do with them, though, right? Which is why exile is such a big deal. Okay. Now, let me get us into Genesis a little bit. Now that we have some key kind of overview themes, big picture, we will come back to these ideas as we go through Old Testament. The Old Testament intro is a lot like just drinking out of a fire hydrant. It's just a lot of information I throw at us. We will circle back to these things as we go through. Let's talk about Genesis for just the last kind of 30 minutes we have here. Okay. One of the best ways, and if you're in my Genesis class on Sunday mornings, I apologize that you're hearing this again. One of the best ways to think about Genesis is to divide up Genesis in what is called I'll spell it for you here in just a second. It's called the Toledot passages. That's Toledot. The Toledot. Toledot. The Toledot passages. You might hear it if you read it in books. It might be called the Toledot formula. Okay. Toledot is a Hebrew word, which I'll give you a couple of the renderings of it. It can mean this is the account of, these are the generations of, these are the descendants of. That's kind of what this word means. Okay. Your textbook, if you have the old textbook, it's on page 78 through 79. I know that because I have it in my notes on my thing here. So it's in there somewhere. 78 through 79, your textbook talks about the Toledot passages, this idea of how we can divide up the book of Genesis and what's actually going on in that book. So what this means is if you want to read Genesis cohesively and kind of be able to tie things together, look for those passages. Look for the places in Genesis where you get the language. These are the generations of, these are the descendants of, or this is an account of. For example, let's walk through and there are several in the book of Genesis. Let's walk through a few of them. Genesis chapter 2, verse 4. Genesis chapter 2, verse 4. It says this. This is the account of Toledot, the heavens and the earth. Okay. This is the account of, again, I'm reading NIV. You might render it a slightly different way. This is the account of the heavens and the earth. Okay. And then if you keep reading over and over and over, I'm going to kind of just pick some of the big ones. Look at Genesis chapter 5, verse 1. This is the written account of, or these are the generations of, or this is the genealogy of Adam's family line. Merely one chapter over, look at chapter 6, verse 9. This is the account of Noah and his family. If you keep reading, you're gonna get these over and over and over and over again throughout Genesis. Okay, these are the way the authors, plural, of Genesis tie the story together. You get another one in chapter 10. This is the account of Shem, Ham, and Japheth, Noah's sons. Remember, after the flood. Then you get 2 in chapter 11. You get 1 in chapter 11, verse 10. This is the account of Shem's family line. Again, this is the Toledot of Shem's family line. And then in 27, this is the account of Terah's family line, right? So these Toledot passages are a key way, are a helpful way of reading and understanding the broad outline of the book of Genesis, okay? Because every time you encounter a Toledot passage, it is signaling to you, hey, the main characters are about to shift. The direction of the story is about to shift. You're about to encounter some new people, places, and things. Pay attention. Every time we get Toledo language, the passage or the passage is signaling to you, hey, new chapter, metaphorically speaking, new chapter in the saga of Genesis. Okay, new movement in the chapter in the book of Genesis. Okay, so pay attention to those. You can do a quick Google search and it'll give you all of them. There are several in the book of Genesis. Go pay attention to them. If you are someone who highlights in your Bible and writes in your Bible, which I encourage you to be, get that list off Google. It actually will give it to you very accurately, and go highlight them in your Bible so you can see them easily. So you can reference back to, oh, I'm in the Abraham movement or the Abraham act, if I can borrow something from Shakespeare. I'm in the Abraham act. I'm in the Joseph act or whatever it might be. Okay? It's a helpful way to read Genesis. It kind of holds it together for us. And then it also points to us that Genesis is a story or is a book about people. It's a book about God's interaction with people, usually with specific individuals, through specific families for a specific purpose. It's not arbitrary. The families that God interacts with are very chosen. They're specific, right? Think of Abraham, etc. Okay. Okay. I don't like spending a lot of time talking about Genesis 1 through 3 when I don't have a lot of time to do it because I feel like it's overdone and I have zero interest ever again in entering into any kind of creation evolution debate. It bores me to tears. I understand that it's important though to other people. And so I'm gonna talk about it for a second. I'm gonna show you, I'll share a slide here in just a second so we can get an idea of how did people in the ancient Near East, during the time of Genesis, etc., view the world. What was their understanding of how the world was actually structured? So let me just briefly say, Genesis 1 through 3 is not concerned in any shape, way, or form with modernity, science, or our current mindset about the world. Has zero concern with science in that way. It has zero concern with a heliocentric, Earth-centered model of the universe. They had no concept of that. Creation evolution conversations are important in some spaces. I'm not the person to have those with. Not that I won't. If you're like, man, I really need to talk to someone about that, please email me, of course. I just had them ad nauseum in like middle school and high school, and I burn out many, many years ago. And so if that's important to you, great, happy to talk about it. Your textbook does do a good job, though, of indicating and reminding us that, again, the language and the stories and the narratives, especially in Genesis 1 through 11, okay, are similar and different, to be sure. They're comparable, at least, to the cultures in and around the time of Israel at this time, or the people in the stories at these times, okay? The Enuma Elish, the Epic of Gilgamesh, all these other ancient writings that we have their own, or they are their own telling of the flood narrative, of creation, of a Tower of Babel-like situation, of the creation of language. Other nations, other cultures are telling their version of the same story, okay? Which begs the question, and this is a huge field of biblical scholarship, and you can enter into it and go get a PhD if you want. How much is what the Israelites are writing informed by other nations and they're co-opting it and making it fit their understanding of their God? How much of it are they writing and garnering and kind of looking over the shoulder of these other nations and saying, okay, yeah, that's great, but our God did it better. Our God is actually the true God, so we're going to tell the story. How much are those interacting with each other is one of the huge questions of biblical scholarship in this field, right? Another question that a lot of people ask is, again, are you going to read Genesis 1 through 11 literally? What the page says is exactly what happened? Or are you, and again, this always freaks people out, so I need to preface this by saying there are Christians on both sides of this camp. Okay, so there are Christians on both sides of the camp. There are Christians who read Genesis 1 through 11 literally. As the text says it, that is exactly what historically actually happened. Okay. There are also Christians over here on this side of the camp who love Jesus. Both these camps love Jesus. Everyone loves Jesus. Okay. They're Christians who say, no, Genesis 1 through 11 is better understood as capital M myth. Okay. It participates in the history of other ancient Near Eastern myths. It is still telling the story of God and the true God of Israel, but it didn't happen literally. Okay. Again, Christians on both sides of that. You can be kind of somewhere in the middle-ish, maybe. But for example, we have to navigate questions about Genesis, specifically Genesis 1 through 11. For example, why do Genesis 1 and 2 disagree with each other? They are both creation accounts, but they wildly disagree with each other. And why is that? And how do we account for that? And what do we do with that? Again, good exegesis is going to help us. Let me give us some answers to that, though. For example, Genesis 1 tells us, hey, God creates the world. It's in these days. It breaks down on this day, it's this. On this day, it's this. All the way down, right? You get to the end. You get to, day 6. He creates livestock. He creates humans. In verse 26, let us make man in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the creation, right? Verse 27, so God makes mankind in his own image. Male and female, he creates them. Genesis chapter 1, we don't get anything about Eve coming out of the rib of Adam. He creates male and female on the spot right there. Okay? That's nowhere in Genesis chapter 1. That's just one tiny little example of like, these are different stories. Genesis chapter 2, starting in verse 4, which is really when Genesis chapter 2 should start. Why the people who put the chapters and verses there decided to start Genesis 2 where they did, I don't understand it. It should really start in 2:4. It says, this is the account of how the heavens and the earth were created. And it is wildly different than what you get in chapter 1. Like, wildly different, right? So again, what do we do with this? Okay, a few responses, and your textbook talks about this. It doesn't talk about it in the Genesis chapter, I don't think. I think it talks about it in the Exodus chapter, which I don't understand why. They should have done it in the Genesis chapter. It talks about this idea, often called the documentary hypothesis, which is a fancy scholarly word that you don't need to remember right now. But basically what they're saying is there are multiple authors producing material for the book of Genesis and other Old Testament books. It's not written by one person. Okay. So what you have in Genesis, specifically Genesis 1 and 2 are a great example of this. You have two authors who are from two different kind of literary traditions or narrative traditions. They've grown up hearing their version of the story in their context, and they bring it to the table, and the scribes who are composing the book of Genesis get these two different traditions about creation of the world. They have similarities. They both say that this one God is the God who created and who gave order and who gave instruction and who has authority. They both are saying similar things. They're saying it in different ways, much like the Gospels. Okay, so we don't need to get freaked out about this because we're okay with it in the Gospels. We're far more comfortable with having multiple authors saying multiple things that are different, but have some really strong similarities. Gospel studies are okay. It freaks us out when we read the Old Testament for some reason. More than likely, what you have in Genesis 1 and 2 is you have two different authors, two different traditions, two different narrative kind of histories being told. They're both telling stories about the true God of Israel and how he is the one God. Notice there's neither story do you have multiple gods. It's the one God who is all powerful, who is creating, who gives instruction, who gives law, who gives order, who creates. And we get similar things about, man and woman being created in his image. We get all that. But more than likely, it's two authors telling their version of the same story. Okay, for different purposes and for different audiences originally. Okay, so that's huge. You can read about this in a commentary on Genesis and do a deep dive and do all that stuff, right? Another great way that we know that something different is happening here is chapter 2, you get language that we don't get in chapter 1. For example, chapter 1, God is just called God. Okay, Elohim. Your book talks about the different names that we get in the Old Testament of God. Usually it's Elohim here in chapter 1. Chapter 2, all of a sudden, God, look at it, verse 4 of chapter 2, which is where chapter 2 should start. It says, this is the account of the heavens and the earth when they were created, when the Lord God, not just God, when the Lord God. Again, notice your text, your text in front of you should have Lord in all caps. The whole word should be in all caps. That is Yahweh. When Yahweh God made the heavens and the earth. Now, an astute reader, which all of you are, will note we don't get Yahweh as a name of God revealed until the burning bush, until the Exodus narrative. Not until then do we have that name revealed to God's people. They don't know him by, that's why Moses is like, what's your name? We don't know it. Who do I tell the people who sent me, right? And God tells them, this is the name you give. So more than likely, again, you have someone who grew up who's writing the story, and again, they're writing them down much later than they actually happened. So the people who are writing these stories down know the story of the Exodus. And so the author or authors who put together chapter 2 are writing about the Lord God, because that's how they're going to refer to him in their story. Okay. Again, the stories have discrepancies. Yeah. The big picture stuff is still the same. God creates. And you can go on deep dives and tangents down there. I'm not here to confirm or deny the documentary hypothesis. I'm not here to, debate about the validity of certain renderings of Genesis 1 and 2. I just need you to know that they are different, and that the reason why they're different is that because different people wrote them for different purposes, for different audiences, with different perspectives. Okay. Just FYI. It's good to know. Okay. I'm moving us on a little bit quickly here. Let me see if I can share my screen again. Now that I don't have people trying to log in to see us here. Okay, can you all see that? Okay. And again, I'll share this with y'all so you can see it. It'll be big on your screen, but I just want to get us at least a little bit of an idea here. This is how ancient Near Eastern peoples thought the world looked. This was their kind of cosmology. This is how they conceived of the world around them. Okay, note here with me that you have the earth. It's a parallel line there. It says earth above it. That's the land. Okay, that's when God creates. He creates land. He separates the land from the water, the dry from the wetland. Right, basically, is you get the land, then you get the seas or the oceans, whichever way your translation narrates that. So here we get the earth, which is the dry land. And then you'll notice kind of around here in these little pools, you have what looks like maybe water or oceans. Okay, that's the waters below that Genesis talks about. Remember with me, God separates the waters above from the waters below. The waters above are this firmament in the sky. Okay, you see this waters above the firmament. It's right there. Ta-da! This is how they envision the world. Okay, we now know this is not how the world exists or looks, unless you're a flat earther, which if you are, please seek help. Anyways, so firmament, water above, and they envision these ideas of floodgates, which is how the water would rain. Okay. And of course, you have the stars, the sun, the moon, which many cultures at the time worshipped. Abraham himself, prior to God's call in his life, more than likely belonged to a group that worshiped the moon. Okay. He was not a God-fearer before God called him. He's not one, like unlike Noah, who we're told right off the bat is righteous. Abraham's a pagan, probably worshiping the moon. This was very common. You have many, many religions at the time that worshipped in their pantheon, or they gave a special place to worship of the sun, the moon, the stars, etc. Right? Okay, so they knew that those existed up there, but Earth is here. Now notice as we go down, you have the ocean kind of, in and around here. You have these columns of the earth. This is important. If you read the book of Jonah, when Jonah goes into the water, he's thrown overboard and he's swallowed by the big fish. And he's praying to God. He talks about, there's language of the pillars of the earth. He goes down, the seaweed like entangles him, right? This is because he conceived of the world as looking like this. He conceives of himself as sinking down into these columns of the earth, down even into Sheol, which simply means the place of the dead. It doesn't mean hell. There's no eternal conscious torment happening there. It just means the place of the dead, okay? So this is how they would have understood their world, okay, in and around the time of the Old Testament. Now, moving later, we start getting some really good Hellenistic learners, and even like Babylonian scholars and Babylonian astrologers who are able to figure out some things way earlier than, like, it just amazes me. But ancient Near Eastern people groups, okay, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, etc., this is how they conceived of the world. It's important for us to keep this in the back of our brain as we come to study, especially the Pentateuch and other earlier parts of the Old Testament, okay? Just want to remind us of that. Okay. Let me also point out, again, kind of key things in Genesis to remember. Genesis is where we get the beginning of the idea of covenant, right? So again, when we talked about covenant a few weeks ago, some people are going to say that there is a covenant with creation at the beginning of the world. Some people aren't. We can debate the validity of that later. But as far as actual covenantal language that we get in Genesis, just note Genesis 9, that's covenant with Noah. Genesis 12, we don't get covenantal language in Genesis 12, but it is the beginning of God's interaction with Abram, which then leads to Genesis 15 and 17, where we do get covenantal language. Okay, Genesis 15, you actually get God cutting the covenant with Abraham. Genesis 17, you get circumcision as the sign of the covenant. So those are kind of some key signposts in the book of Genesis. But again, covenant, God's dwelling places, which again in Genesis we just have Eden, then we're kind of left wondering what's going to happen. And then those Toledot passages will really help divide up Genesis for you and help you get your arms around. Genesis is huge. It covers thousands of years. Okay, thousands of years Genesis covers. It is long and it goes on, right? So those Toledot passages give us a good handle on how to actually read Genesis, how to approach Genesis. And it's one of the few times I'll actually tell you that a Google search of saying, hey, what are the references from the Toledot passages in Genesis are mentioned? Google search is great for that. It actually will give them all to you quite handily, without a whole lot of fluff. So that's great. Here's what we're going to do. I'm going to give us some time for Q&A. Next week, we are going to do a little bit more stuff with Genesis. If you guys have more questions about it, again, we don't have time to I could do a 20-week class on Genesis, which I'm actually doing an 18-week class on Genesis right now on Sunday mornings. An hour and a half to intro the Old Testament and do Genesis is just almost undoable. I'm not going to be able to do all of it. I'm trying to give you the key signposts, okay? And then let your textbook supplement. Next week, we will do Exodus. Exodus is my favorite Old Testament book. So I just greedily take usually a whole lesson to do Exodus because I love it. But you'll also read chapters on like Deuteronomy and Numbers as well. So we'll kind of do a little bit of that. The next week, so 2 weeks from tonight, Clay is teaching. You notice in your textbook, hopefully, that your textbook mentions the covenants and then talks about the idea of covenantal theology and dispensational theology, which is a huge debate within Christianity. Dispensational theology, covenant theology. Clay is going to come in. Actually, I lied. That's not that lecture. The lecture he's going to do in 2 weeks from tonight is he's going to walk you through how he prepares a Bible study and how he does exegesis. So we're trying to go back and forth between them so we don't forget. So we keep practicing things. So Clay's going to walk you through how he prepares a lesson, which is really practical. He does this, like if you're leading any type of study, any type of Bible study, any type of small group for any age, this is a great lecture. He's going to walk you through some of that, share some of his resources. So again, we're trying to we don't want to forget exegesis. We want to keep going back to it. And then the week after that, my friend Paul will be with us and he'll do Leviticus. So we'll be in Pentateuch for a while. I'll have you reading other material so you can kind of get ahead. But FYI, next week will be Exodus, a little bit of Deuteronomy. So that's where we're kind of going. I'll backtrack to Genesis if we want to briefly. But again, there's no way to teach all. I'm not even gonna be able to teach all the books of the Old Testament. We're getting our arms around the big story of kind of the major movements of the Old Testament. Okay. Let me pause right there and see if there's any questions or comments that I can answer before we are done for the evening.
I have a question, Lorian. So when you talked about where is it?
Monotheism.
Thank you. And you talked about other gods. Are those things that these days would be like power, wealth, greed?
Sure.
So, are those the types of small g gods you're talking about?
Sure, that's a great question. Let me offer some clarity. And this will actually come up several times because when we get to the New Testament and all of a sudden out of nowhere, seemingly, because if you've read the Old Testament carefully, you get to the New Testament, all of a sudden there are a lot of demons that we didn't have in the Old Testament. The Old Testament hardly ever mentions them, ever. Okay. New Testament, right off the bat, Jesus' first thing that he does most of the time is start casting out demons, right? So we got to kind of figure out what's going on there. But yeah, I think the easy answer for some of us is the little g gods now are like money and sex and power and wealth and violence and stuff. Here's my response to that. My response to that is that's way too safe of an answer. These other little g gods absolutely exist. And they animate in the same way that gasoline animates your car. They give energy and power. I don't mean energy in a woo-woo way. I mean power, like gasoline to your car, to anything that is not of God. So again, note with me how they understood in the Old Testament. that rulers and the gods of the nations that were not Israel, that they were subject to foreign gods, to actual powers that are not of God, of our God, the one true God, right? So demons absolutely exist and participate in the system of these foreign gods, these little g gods. Paul talks about how, hey, our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but what's it against? The rulers and authorities and principalities of this dark world and the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places. Real things, not things like, oh, power and violence. I believe, and I'm not alone here, that these little g gods that will one day be completely subjected to the one true God and dealt with at the end of time, like Revelation talks about, I believe that these little g gods give life to those things and spur on things like greed and violence and war and power and subjugation of other people, all those types of things that we declare as evil and wrong 100%. They are participating in that system, right? And we'll talk more about this as we move forward. So kind of keep that question in the back of your mind. Okay, Meredith, you asked in the chat, why Abraham? Divine lottery? Yes. Yeah, Abraham is not chosen for any merit of his own. We get even language later in the prophets where Israel is reminded, hey, you did nothing to earn being picked. You were nothing. You were basically pagan worshipers. And I, in my mercy, picked you. And it doesn't make sense to us. And we want to bucket the system because we're like, there's got to be a reason, right? There's got to be this. We're not given any reason. God picks Abraham and Abraham's family seemingly out of the blue. And that's really what the text leaves us at, is not because Abraham is not righteous. Unlike Noah, Abraham is not, he's not a righteous man. He's a pagan. He's not doing anything good. It's not like God looked in the future and saw that, oh, Abraham's going to be good, I'll pick him. No, no, no. God picks him and then sets off on the course of action. And that's the best answer we can give. Nothing of Abraham on himself. Cameron, go for it.
I was just gonna piggyback off of what Christine said on the like monotheism and like God, little God thing. But you kind of touched on that as well, is like, because I think even in Daniel, like when the angel, I think it's maybe Gabriel, appears to Daniel, he said he was fighting a principality over Persia, and I think that's often is like the principality, spiritual principality, and so at least. Is that so? That's what you're saying is like the spiritual principalities, the demonic forces who have their own kind of probably hierarchical structure within the spiritual kingdom.
Yes, 100%. Yeah, Daniel, like the Gabriel, is it Gabriel? I think it's Gabriel. He shows up and he's like, dude, I would have been here sooner, but I was battling the prince of Persia, like this ruler over Persia, like their little g god. I was duking it out with him, right? Sorry, I'm late, but I'm here now. So yeah, like again, the gods of the nations, real, not just an idea, right? Okay. Giselle, can you clarify on what is considered heavenly places, like beyond the earth or space? Yeah, so real quick answer to this. If you remember like the book of Job, when Job opens, essentially you see God in the heavenly council, right? So the Satan, which again, Satan is not a proper name, it's a title. It just means adversary or accuser. It's a title, it's a role that is filled within the heavenly pantheon, as it were. Again, not that these other beings are equal with God. They clearly serve God and are subject to his rule, in the instance of Job, at least. But you have this interaction of them talking and reasoning together, and clearly to be the accuser is not a bad thing. That's a role that's in the heavenly pantheon at the time, right? So yeah, physical space is, yeah, I mean, can we point to on a map to the place where where the spiritual forces, the heavenly places aren't? No, it's just there is an unseen realm to steal a book title. And I don't mean that in a woo-woo way. I mean that in a very real, like actual way. There is an unseen realm. None of the demons that Jesus casts out do you actually see. You see them when they're inside of pigs or inside of people, but you don't see them. So again, I don't say this like scare us. but this is the reality. Like these are real things. And to be about the business of God is to be about the business of real things in a real world. So yeah, and we will continue to talk about this more. This topic will come up again, I promise. So we are at 8 o'clock, and I want to honor y'all's time. Let me close us in prayer, and we will be good to go. God, thank you so much for great conversation tonight. Just kind of a whirlwind topic to try to cover. So God, would you help us kind of zero in on some key things as we continue reading and learning about the Old Testament? Holy Spirit, would you be with us? In the name of Jesus, we pray. Amen. Thanks, guys. We'll be back in person next week, and I'll see you all there.